All right, so now we're going to hear from Martin on the subject of the transcendental argument for morality.
Transcendental?
Yes, so
I hope you define that first.
we'll work on that. So this short oratory is a third in a series of oratories on the subject of ethics and morality. And you may recall that this series is in response to my 18-year-old son's search for moral certainty in a religious world. And as you may know, my son is involved in choir, and that has put him deeply within the Christian world, and that's what he's playing off of, trying to understand in that context. Now, I don't regret that my son is involved in the Christian world at all, far from it. My son's participation in choir is certainly one of the most positive formative experiences of his 18 years. As an aside, my son has just finished Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, and I fully expect that he will be submitting an essay by the deadline for our essay contest, which is April the 1st. And I look forward to hearing him present his essay here sometime this year in order to get his $100 reward. So, morality is a set of behavioral rules by which we govern our actions in society, and ethics is a study of the foundation of morality. My first oratory in the series, I talked about Plato's famous ring of Gyges, and I said that it's ineffective for most people. And you'll recall that the ring of Gyges is this magic ring that was found by a shepherd, and that if you turn it in the right way, then you can become invisible, and you can go out and do evil deeds and make profit for yourself, and then return to a physical state by altering the ring. Now, I suggested that this type of ring would not be effective for most of us because we cannot live with the guilt associated with our own acts of injustice, even if we're not caught. I recounted my stories from my own life in which I recounted childhood misdeeds which I suffered guilt from even to this very day, over 50 years later. I argued that PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, that soldiers suffer is a result of battlefield guilt, things that they did which they personally regret and suffer from, even though they might be public to the authorities, and they're not going to be punished for those things, yet they still suffer. I hypothesized in my speech that only sociopaths and psychopaths can get by with that, and they're about, unfortunately, 1 in 25 of us is a sociopath. And for them, the ring of Gyges does work. In the second oratory, I argued that ethics and aesthetics are closely related, and this is kind of an odd claim. I recounted stories to illustrate Aristotle's thesis that the essence of virtue is that it is an instance of the beautiful. The expression that that was a beautiful thing to do perfectly captures Aristotle's idea. As a reminder, because I want to reinforce these virtues, I'm going to list the 13 virtues. Courage, independence, generosity, magnificence, magnanimity or greatness of soul, appetite for honor, gentleness, truthfulness, charm, friendliness, sense of shame, righteous indignation, and justice. Aristotle was a taxonomist. He actually classified plants and animals. He actually classified constitutions, 126, I think, of them. The only one known is the Constitution of Athens, the only one preserved. And he also classified moral virtues, which I gave you the list of his classification. So what Aristotle is doing is not, rationally deducing them. He's looking out into the world and saying, what do people think are virtues? And then he's counting them, right? He's just classifying and counting. They think that's good, they think that's good. As an example of courage, I gave the story of our successful effort to save a person who was being robbed. I'm talking about the Fellowship of Reason, when we were walking near the Jimmy Carter Center. As an example of the vice of cowardice, I gave the story from the movie Melancholia, where the father is cowering in a stable, waiting for the world to come to an end, while his family he doesn't attend to them and help them with this difficulty. In this present oratory, I want to talk about argumentative certainty, right? Aristotle claimed that one could only hope for a level of precision appropriate to the subject. Now, an example of this is the idea of comparing a mathematical truth with an ethical truth. So, if we have 2 + 2 = 4, or if we have the Pythagorean theorem, you can prove those things with perfect certainty, right? However, to prove that courage is a virtue may be less precise than activity. So, the arguments that I have given in the 2 prior oratories in support of the moral objectivism are intuitive and hopefully plausible. In my first oratory, we know from personal experience and introspection that private guilt is very difficult to bear. In the second oratory, we know that we admire and encourage courageous action. We know that by introspection. We know from introspection that we admire Andrew Carnegie's gift of 1,687 public libraries. We know from introspection that we admire the dignity of the couple in the Titanic who are, the elderly couple, they're cuddling and the water is rushing through the ship and they're going to die very shortly, but they're dying with some dignity. And of course, dying with dignity is a very popular trope and we love to see that in film. Now, the skeptic, though, or the moral relativist might demand a higher degree of precision. Now, on important questions like, what's the justification of morality, he might say, do more for me than intuition or mere plausibility. So Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, the 1,069-page book that I mentioned my son had just finished, is a massive argument for objective morality, and it's convinced hundreds of thousands of young people that there is an objective morality. The great story of Atlas Shrugged provides an intuitive and a plausible, and some will argue a precise argument for moral objectivism. Recall John Galt's 90-page speech, which some people regard as the substantial argument for morality. It's not intuitive and it's not plausible. I mean, it is plausible, but it's related to precision in argument. In today's short oratory, I want to sketch out the transcendental argument for morality. Now, this phrase, transcendental morality, is not a popular usage, and it denotes a kind of argument that uses reflection upon the assumptions in argument to find validation. The short explanation of it is this. The moral relativist must implicitly assume moral objectivism in uttering his position. Now, Ayn Rand called this the fallacy of the stolen concept. And so let's see if I can tease this out a little bit. So what are we trying to do? We are trying to show by introspection and analysis that the ethical relativist, simply by taking up the argument, implicitly accepts ethical objectivism. And so the way we proceed here is to try to figure out what are the assumptions that one has to have in order to engage another in argumentation. And I've come up with 6. These are 6 common assumptions that I think go without saying in the case of some 2 people engaging in argument. Number 1, 2 people do exist, a proponent and an opponent. Number 2, they share a common language. They have common reference to the words have common references in the real world, and if there's an oak tree before the 2 of them, they both agree that's a tree. 3, there is a mutual admiration between the 2, sufficient at least to engage in the conversation. 4, we recognize or assume that the other person is autonomous. 5, we have abandoned the use of force, at least for the moment, in dealing with this person. We are looking for an actual agreement from the other person, and we're not looking for mere words of agreement extracted by violence or extortion. And 6, at the end of the argument, we hope that there might be some clarification or possibly mutual agreement. So let's look at these 6 things more closely. The first one is 2 people are present. Solipsism is a serious philosophical position going back to Gorgias, Plato's time. Here are 3 propositions from solipsism. Nothing exists. number one. Number two, even if something exists, nothing can be known about it. And number three, even if something could be known about it, knowledge about it can't be communicated to others. So that position is abandoned, though, when the solipsist necessarily, when he goes into a conversation with others. So imagine a serious conversation with a solipsist. Imagine he opens, if he's serious, he opens with the claim, "You are a figment of my imagination." Unless your opponent brings with her some extraordinary virtue, like it's Marilyn Monroe and she's expressing some sexual interest in you, your verbal intercourse, pun intended, is not going to happen, right? You're just not going to talk to somebody like that. So if you're having an argument, that's not, the solipsist can't be there, expressive. Two, they share a common language. You can't talk about the meaning of life if you're an American and don't speak Chinese and your proponent is a Chinese person who doesn't have English or any other common language. It's not going to happen. Number three, there is mutual valuing between the two conversants. In the absence of mutual valuing, there will be no voluntary interaction. Any voluntary interaction, the goal of which is to persuade one another, will only occur in the presence of mutual admiration or at least a minimal degree. 4, each person is presumed to be autonomous. An argument presumes the presence of two self-ruling beings. When we engage in discussion with another person, we expect that we're dealing with a principal rather than an agent. Sometimes we negotiate with agents, for example, in a car salesman. If we reach a limit of the agent's authority, then he'll go in the back room there and talk to the sales manager who's a little bit closer to the ultimate authority. But even the sales manager is bound by rules, and he's bound by rules set by the business owner. In an argument between two people, the assumption is that each can decide for herself on the spot if any concessions are to be made. Each actor is in contact with his own conscious mind and knows whether he is persuaded or not, firsthand and introspectively. As an aside, this assumption works a refutation of determinism. A person who engages another in an argument assumes implicitly that the other is not predetermined by genetics to his current opinion. Otherwise, we would not engage in the argument with the automaton. 5, we have abandoned in the argument, by the active argument, the use of force, at least temporarily. Reason and force are opposites. We can deal, when we must, with others by force or by agreement. These are the only two possibilities. Another situation, of course, is that we just don't have any relations at all. But if there's a transaction, there are only two types, force and voluntary. 6, and finally, there might be a clarification or mutual agreement. So at the end of the conversation of the argument, there is an assumption that the possibility of a clarification between the two people or is involved, or the brass ring, there might be mutual agreement. So here is the statement of this idea by another person, and this is the motive for my speech as I read this paragraph, and so this is what I did with this, what I just did is what I did with this paragraph, but here's this paragraph, and it probably states it better, so let me read this paragraph. In response to the relativist proponent, it is essentially pointed out that by virtue of his own engagement in argumentation, he has already effectively rejected his own thesis, because argumentation is an activity, a special, conflict-free form of interaction between a proponent and an opponent, with the specific purpose of clarifying and possibly coming to a mutual agreement concerning some rival truth claims. As such, it presupposes the acceptance as valid of such norms or rules of human conduct as make argumentation itself possible. And it is impossible, then, to argue against or deny the validity of such norms without therefore running into a performance or dialectic contradiction. End of quote. So in conclusion, in summary, any argument with another, including a conversation about the foundation of morality and ethics, which is of particular interest to us, contains at least the following assumptions, the 6 I mentioned. 2 people exist, proponent and opponent. 2, they share a common language. 3, they value one another at least to some extent. 4, each assumes that the other is autonomous and he's acting as a principal and not an agent. 5, we have in the act of arguing abandoned, at least temporarily, the use of force. And 6, the goal of the argument is clarification or possibly mutual agreement. In this, my third in the series of oratory, I have today argued that moral relativism is not a position that can be maintained in argument with another without committing the contradiction of the form A is non-A. Of course, this is not to say that a person cannot maintain her moral relativism. It simply means that she cannot enter into an argument about it without committing the fallacy of the stolen concept in the terms that Ayn Rand uses. Perhaps this intuition of this glaring fallacy is at the root of violence that we see in our culture today. We see in the news evidence that some people have abandoned reason entirely and resort simply to violence. Many public institutions ban free speech on their campuses. Either free speech is too expensive to provide security for the messenger and her audience, or the institution opposes the message. We see in the news violent people who attack others with bike locks or eggs or milkshakes to shut them up. Some extremists even assail politicians by shooting them in baseball games. If morality is relative, then your only means of enforcing your views is by violence, whether simple rape, robbery, or murder, or by some sort of a majority rule of the form, the might of the majority makes right. If morality is objective, then the most important tools of civilization are at your disposal: reason, evidence, and argument. More to come next time.